series. Thank you all for being here. I promise you it will not be a waste of time. Okay. My name again is Bob Santelli, and we've been doing for almost a year now, as Larry said, a series on the 1960s. We've been in this 50th anniversary for well, 10 years now. We're almost finished with it. So how appropriate that we end with an evening with the Merry Pranksters. I don't really have to tell you who they are or why they are important, and if I did, then maybe for our students here, but you'll catch on quick enough. I just want to say, just to sum up, that you know, when you think of cultural warriors and you think of cultural revolutionaries, I think the Merry Pranksters define that term, especially in the 1960s, and with the late Ken Kesey being certainly the center point of all of this. What they did was they made history, and we put history around it simply because some of it is now so emboldened in myth that what we're here to do tonight is break away the fact and the fiction and let you hear the true story. Before I bring them out, and you'll see we're going to have a conversation here, and in the back are some of the original footage that Ken and company took on a number of trips. One, the most famous one, of course, being in 1964, going across country to the New York World's Fair. If you read the book, The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, you know all about that. I'm going to talk a little bit about Tom Wolfe in that book as well. I just want to say that I had the fortune back in the late 90s when I was at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame at the time. We did an exhibit on called I Want to Take You Higher. It was all about psychedelic rock in the 1960s. It just so happened that my editor at Penguin Books, starting already, jeez. Penguin Books, my editor was Ken Kesey's editor, and I told him I'm doing this exhibit. He said, well, you ought to talk to Ken Kesey. And a week later, I was on my way for the first time to come to Oregon and to go down to Eugene to meet Ken. And I knocked on the door, and Faye, his wife, said, Ken's in the barn. And he says, he's expecting you. I said, oh, great. And I walked then into the barn, and he looked at me, he said nothing, he threw me a pitchfork and says, get started. And this is a guy who grew up in West New York, New Jersey, right across the river. I never even touched a pitchfork before. But I got good at the hay thing, and we became friends. Long story short, we were able to put back on the road, I should say, the second bus, brought it to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and had a pretty crazy time with these guys in the bus for a couple of weeks, ultimately winding up in Cleveland and became the centerpiece. The bus became the centerpiece of that exhibit. I can tell you this, without going into the full story, I remember 3 quotes from that particular trip that summarize it perfectly. Number 1 is Ken, as we were approaching Cleveland, Ohio, pats me on the back and he said, Bob, you're the best. I'm thinking, what is he talking about? He never said that before. He said, of all the times we've been in the bus, we've always been escorted out of cities with police cars. This is the first time we're being escorted in. A series of Cleveland police cars whisked us into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Everyone felt like, well, we felt pretty good, I guess. The second one was when Ken Babbs was being interviewed, and this was a quote that made, I think, the front page of Cleveland Plain Dealer. He said, this is too beautiful to be Oz. It must be Cleveland. No one had ever heard anything like that before. Trust me. And then the third one, somewhere, some place along the way, I think it was outside of Columbus, Ohio, Ken asked me if I had any kids. And I said, yeah, I have 3 young kids at home. He says, well, call your wife, we need kids on this bus. And I said, you want my kids to be on the bus with us? He said, yeah, we can't go into Cleveland without kids. Okay, call my wife. She drives the full day down to just outside of Columbus. And my 3 kids, who were at the time 13, 11, something like that, 7 or 8, and 5. And the third quote was from my 5-year-old son, who sat on my lap the entire time. And that quote was, Dad, these people are weird. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Ken Babbs. Okay, I will introduce them again. Okay, so this is George Walker. This is Ken Babbs. He has a book coming out real soon on all of this. This is Carolyn Garcia, better known as Mountain Girl. And this is Zane Kesey, Ken's son, who was on that trip to Cleveland. Well, we finally got this together. And Zane, you told me just minutes ago that we've never done this before, huh? With all four of you? This is the first time everyone's together?
It's too scary.
Well, we've done a lot of things together.
Yeah.
All together like this?
It's the first time we've done this.
This.
It's always the first time we've done this.
We're filming this for the archives here because I teach a class on the 1960s on occasion, and the hope is that we will use elements of this, hopefully.
Where's the camera?
The camera's right up there.
Okay, everybody wave.
And so hopefully we can recall some fun stories and also give some sort of context. So when students who weren't even close to being born, when you guys were running across country on the further bus, that they get a sense of what that was like. So before we get going, clearly the guy I wish certainly was here would be Ken Kesey. So in order for us, for those of you who don't know much about him, no better than his son to give a quick thumbnail sketch of your dad and his importance. Take us up to the time of the mid-1960s. Where was he born? Where is he from, etc.?
Oh. What? He's from Colorado, Arkansas, one of those. Definitely Lahana, Colorado. And he came out here very young, and Oregon has been his home just forever. Brief stint down there during the 60s and writing books and coming back up here to do the family farm thing.
So basically, this is a Eugene story. You guys come up here. You're actually born in Eugene as well, and all three of you live in Eugene still to this day.
I live in
Stanford Hospital.
in Scappoose part-time.
Okay. Ken, you're
I'm 20 miles east of Eugene, up Lost Creek Valley.
I might still be living in Eugene, I'm not sure.
But Ken is here, and at least here, and you guys are back and forth between Eugene and San Francisco. But before we get to that, of course, Ken is the author of two of America's greatest 20th century novels. Certainly One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, required reading, and a great film with Jack Nicholson. I'm sure you've all seen it. And then Sometimes a Great Notion, another great novel that doesn't quite get the acclaim that Cuckoo's Nest does, but if you live in Oregon, it should be required reading as well.
It's a better book.
Yeah.
It's definitely better writing.
Yeah.
More mature, he was, more advanced as a writer. After he'd done one, we knew how.
But you guys ultimately come together how? Ken, are you the first one to meet him of the three of you?
Yeah, I met Kesey at Stanford in the graduate writing program there in 1958. He came from Oregon and I came from Ohio. And they called us the old boys. And, until they got to know us, and then they would say, they call us the uh-oh boys.
So you were in the writing program at Stanford as well?
Oh yeah, it was a tremendous class. We had Wendell Berry in there too, and Ernest Gaines, I don't know if you remember him, he just died last week. But finally, I had a book come out in 2011, and Wendell said to me, he says, "You're the last one in the class to get published."
George, how do you meet Ken?
We had a mutual friend, Mike Hagan, who unfortunately didn't join us today, but he's one of the original Merry Pranksters and still alive and now living in Eugene. And thank you. Okay, there, right there, okay, I got it. And Hagan and I became friends, and he was talking about Kesey all the time. By this time, Ken had already graduated. He graduated the year before I became a freshman at Oregon, so I never knew him there. But he was a legend. You know, people talked about him. You know, he did antics from day one. I think he was born doing stuff, born to be on stage.
And an athlete too.
And an athlete. And charisma that was off the scale. Fantastic magnet of attention wherever he went. And so Hagen had talked him up, and I'd always wanted to meet him for a couple of years, and then he showed up, and the rest, as they say, is some sort of history.
When he was there in Oregon in his fraternity, one of the fraternity brothers had a Jeep, and they hooked it up with this big slingshot on the back, pulled it back like that, and loaded it up with water balloons. And they went around the campus shooting them, and they went along a field where the ROTC guys were out there. They started shooting them into him. And the head guy says, "Fix bayonets!" So they took off down the road, and the road they were on was the sorority house road. And all the sorority women were out there in their best outfits. They were having their annual singing contest, which all of them were out there on the porches singing. "Oh, you know, those $5 hookahs, they are such whores, they couldn't get a boyfriend." Slapped them all. And we were having this time, they looked, and here the guys were with the bayonets, and off they went.
Did you go to Oregon too at undergrad? Or you were in
No,
Ohio?
I went as an undergrad. I went to Miami University of Ohio.
And when you were at
I was at the U of O, yes.
And Carolyn?
I kind of missed college. I was busy. But I live kind of near the U of O part of the time, and it's interesting to look at college culture. It's so different from how we are as pranksters and how we are as people. College is a very different place, and so it's kind of exciting to come over here and meet all of you young people.
So how do you meet Ken?
Let's see, I met Ken. Neil Cassidy took me on a wild ride when I was probably 17 or 18 years old, and drove all over the Bay Area talking a blue streak, and wound up driving into Ken's driveway at 4 o'clock in the morning, just as at first light. And I saw the bus, and I just went crazy. I couldn't believe what I was touching and feeling. This bus that was like so handled by so many people and had lumpy paint, and it was so interesting. And then here came Ken around the back of the bus. And he says, "Oh, hi, everybody be quiet. We don't want the dogs to start barking." And he took us back to his little writing studio, and it was Neil Cassidy and Cassidy's friend Bradley and I getting a lecture about how Ken fitted sentences together. And he had little pieces of paper all taped together with pieces of sentences on them that he was working on. It was fascinating.
Amazing. So Ken is down in San Francisco, or what was he? La Honda?
This is La Honda, which is a beautiful little town southwest of San Francisco, about 40 miles.
Ken, you were in, if I'm not mistaken, you were in Vietnam too, just before this, or?
Well, yeah, at that time when I was growing up, you had to go into something in the draft. And so I applied for an NROTC scholarship to college and got it, and it meant what I wanted. I wanted to go in as an officer. And so I went in the Marine Corps, and then I went to flight school, and then I flew helicopters, and I was in Vietnam in '62 and '63. And that novel I was talking about is a novel about that. It's called Who Shot the Water Buffalo.
So the idea of pranksters and the idea of you coming together as a very loose family of like-minded individuals, let's just say, where and how does that start? Anyone have the
It started with Kesey when he was at Stanford the year after I left, and he stayed another year. He was subject in an experiment they were doing there at the VA hospital, where they gave them different drugs to see how they reacted. And so this one drug, talked about was really a wowzer dowser. And so they said, well, let's fake it. Let's pretend nothing's happening, and they'll cut us loose and we'll be out in the streets hot.
That was always the aim.
Well, those experiments came to an end, and Kesey got a job there at that same hospital as an aide in the VA hospital, and he was in there one night and looking out in the day room from this window, keeping track of the patients, and he noticed over there in the door that, hey, that's the door to the office of the doctor who was conducting those experiments. So he got the keys off the wall, and he went over and found one and opened the door. And he went in and was looking around, and he opened the desk drawer and looked in there. And his eyes bugged out, and his hair stood out on end, and his aura went bouncing off the ceiling. And there were red and green and golden lights flying around. And he reached in there, picked this bottle out, and looked at it, and put it in his pocket, and walked out with it. 500 doses of pure Sandoz LSD.
And so it goes from there.
Well, yeah, because he brought it back to he lived at Perry Lane there, and being the guy he is, he was a center of a lot of activity and a lot of people coming there, and so that's when the walls first started getting hard.
Carolyn, so you of course, you play a large role. You happen to have a relationship with a very famous rock star from San Francisco. Where does that fit into this storyline?
Well, when the pranksters, and I was a prankster before I met Jerry Garcia, but Ken and his buddies decided they needed to have a band come and play at the house for a party that he was going to put on. So they found this little raggle-taggle group of very young musicians to come all the way out to La Honda and set up and play with what looked like sort of dime store equipment at the time. And they were pretty good. They were a lot of fun, and they were scruffy, and I don't think they'd had LSD before, and they were subsequently given some, and the concert didn't last really a long time, but it was good. But you know, several years went by, and we had been doing it. We then subsequently did acid tests. We subsequently got busted and had to go to Mexico and so on. And it wasn't until we came back from Mexico that Jerry and I got together, sort of all of a sudden. And it was a really special time. That period, so many people's lives changed, and we had the courage to actually go do something completely different from what all of our other friends our age were doing, and I guess it turned out.
How old were you when you left home?
I had just passed my 17th birthday, and my brother was doing graduate work at Stanford, and I'm coming from Poughkeepsie, New York, which is where I'm from, and so he was leaving to go back for his next year of work at Stanford. He says, hey, why don't you come with us? Because I had just gotten kicked out of school, you know, the usual story. So anyhow, it was time for me to leave home. So I got in their VW bus, which was a 62 VW bus, which has the slider windows, by the way. And off we went to California, and it was a long, hard trip at 57 miles an hour. That's top speed. But arrived in Palo Alto and got a job the very next day. I went to the Stanford hiring office, and they sent me over to meet the head of the chemistry department, because I said I had a science background, which I did. And it was Carl Gerasi running the organic chemistry department. He hired me on the spot, and so I had a job. And suddenly I was embedded in Palo Alto in a very short period of time. And that was just the beginning of the rest of the story.
Well, all of you were at just the forefront as things start getting going. The counterculture gets going in the Bay Area.
That was 1963.
Yeah, so 63. So what's San Francisco like? What's the scene like on the street? Is the hate happening at this time? Is there anything going on?
San Francisco was incredibly conservative at that time. People wore white gloves when they went out to shop. You know, gray wool coats, and you know, it was just not at all. It was not an artist town. There was a tiny enclave of artists in North Beach where City Lights book still stands as an icon of difference, and. So that was about it, but I couldn't really get to know any of those people. I wasn't old enough. I didn't know enough about poetry, so I didn't have a platform there. So I was very pleased to meet these people, I'll tell you what.
Well, as Kesey said, in those days there was a wave came in, and we were lucky to ride on that wave. We caught the crest of the wave, but we weren't the only ones riding that wave. There were thousands of others, and it swept into San Francisco, and he was telling this to an audience in like 1972. He said it's swept across the country and it's all the way to Kansas now.
Kesey used to say that we didn't really start this. That, like he said, we saw that we felt this wave. We sensed something happening, and we were able to ride that wave. And eventually, as waves do, it crashed on the beach.
That's the Atlantic Ocean.
What I've been seeing travel around the country the last couple of years is another wave is beginning now. We're seeing, if any of you are surfers, you understand how waves come in sets, and there's big sets and bigger sets, and there's bigger and smaller waves within the sets of waves. And then there's the really huge set that comes around every half a century maybe, and the giant waves that are in that set. And the 60s was like a social giant wave and a giant set that it was waves like World War I and World War II. And finally the 60s was the biggest wave of the whole set. And we were there, and fortunate enough, and rode that wave. And what I'm seeing now is another set of waves is upon us. And we have a chance to ride another wave like that. And I think that if we all get together, if we all have our minds in the right place and our consciousness is in the right place, that we can surf this wave all the way to the beach. And we can find ourselves standing on the beach in the sun. If we keep our minds, or keep our consciousness together, we can do that.
That's pretty deep, George. How come the bus? You talk about a wave and surfing, but it's really a bus. The bus becomes the symbol.
Well,
you were the driver.
I not only was the driver, I was there the moment the idea struck us. We had been in New York, Ken and I, for the Broadway play opening of Cuckoo's Nest, the Kirk Douglas production. And I had driven out from California. His whole family was there, and they'd all flown. And then, because I had this car and a big bottle of boiled down mescal and peyote tar, he decided to ride back to California with me. And just like that, it was a lot of laughs. Except about the second day out, the news turned dark. It was the day Kennedy was killed. And what that did was it galvanized the consciousness in a way that present events might happen like that. We might be seeing another galvanizing moment. Time will tell, and it might tell soon. But nonetheless, by then we had decided that we wanted to come back to New York in the summer to see the World's Fair, to experience the World's Fair. Ken had told stories about their visit to the Seattle World's Fair with all these aforesaid psychedelics as kind of power boosters for the event, and how much fun they'd had. And I didn't want to miss out on that, so I was very encouraging on this idea. Yeah, let's do it. Let's come back here and see the fair. And then we started thinking, well, God, Babbs going to want to go, and Hagen's going to want to go, and we started making a list, and boy, we're not going to be able to get all of us in the car. Well, let's see, Babbs has got this Volkswagen bus, and Ken's got a Suburban, and I've got a Chevy station wagon, and then we were in Eugene, And at that time, the city of Eugene had gone out of the public transportation business, and so some privateer had gone around, bought a bunch of secondhand shorty school buses, painted them all dark green, and ran their own bus service. And I saw this, and I thought, wow, that's what we need, Ken. And he said, right, let's get a bus, find a bus, and I'll buy it. And so the search was on, and eventually we found further. And the rest
It belonged to a family in San Francisco, a Catholic family, and it had 6 bunks in the back, and it had a sink and a stove and a refrigerator and all that. And the family had gotten so big that it would no longer fit in the bus. So Hagen went up and saw it and came back and told Kesey, and he went up and bought it. It was perfect.
Zane, just to get you in the conversation here, so you're in charge of the Kesey archives. Are there things from this period that you have in the archives?
Well, yeah. What I have here and now is a hard drive from UCLA Film Archives, the Film Preservation Society, where we sent all the film to be stored in all their hermetically sealed, preserved archives. And they've just recently transferred all of it and sent it down in this huge hard drive. And this is me seeing a lot of this for the first time. It's the first time I've opened it up is here.
Wow. Nice.
Well, how did they wind up in UCLA?
That was when Magic Trip came along, and what's his name?
Alex Gibney.
Yeah, Gibney made a deal with them, and Spielberg and Scorsese, where they're going to transfer a bunch of it and send it up to them up there. And I was happy to not have to worry about it.
Right. So the bus, you have the bus. The next summer is the World's Fair. And now you decide.
We actually bought it in the spring of '64.
64.
Yeah, we got the bus.
Whose idea is it to paint the bus?
Kesey's. Yeah, we had this bus. It was yellow with black trim, just like all the rest of the school
There's
buses.
beautiful film.
And we had it in Kesey's yard, and a friend of mine who lived in Berkeley and called me and said that he had acquired some really good LSD, and by this time all the stuff Kesey had gotten had been consumed, so I ran up there and got some. We all took a big dose, and Ken started painting on the bus, handing out paintbrushes and cans of paint. He started going through, finding a can of this paint, a can of that paint that he had lying around the house. And Roy was there, Roy Seaburn, who was the best artist among us. He was actually a real artist who did paintings. You know, those things on flat canvas with all the colors, he did those. So he started painting, and it started looking good. Most of us were just kind of smearing stuff around, but after a while, it turned into what it was.
Roy put the name up on the board up on the front there, further. And Gene Burton asked him, why further? And he says, I feel like this is a sign that will keep the bus going down the road and overcome all obstacles of breakdowns and cop stops.
It was astonishingly successful.
Yeah, so over the front door, there was a little tiny note. When I first saw the bus, it impressed me enormously. And I'm peering in it. It's written in little tiny script right over the bus door. It says, "Nothing lasts."
So we were leaving Houston, and Jane Burton wanted to put her suitcase up on top of the rest of them, and I said, I'll do that for you, Jane. And she says, oh, thank you. And I went up and I tied it on there, and we were driving down the road, and we looked out, and there was her suitcase wide open, all her clothes behind. And she was really furious. She says, what are we going to do about this? And Kesey shrugged, he said, nothing lasts. And she says, is that all you can say about that? She says, what about this doofo here that tied the thing on the top? And what was the other thing he said? I can't remember. It was good.
I remember an exception to the nothing lasts. I remember one thing that actually did last. Somewhere during the '64